Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of the Lansdowne Lecture Series at the University of Victoria. My name is Kathy Chan, and I am the Acting Director of UVic's Center for Studies in Religion and Society for the 22-23 academic year. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which represents a collaboration between the Center and the Religion, Culture, and Society program in UVic's Faculty of Humanities. I'd like to open this proceeding by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university sits, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples who have continuing historical relationships with the land. I must say that both this acknowledgement of the Indigenous custodians of these territories and the topic of climate, catastrophe, and faith seem particularly timely this week, as Victoria has broken several heat records this month and just experienced the driest 90-day period since 1898. So I'd like to really thank Professor Jenkins for being with us tonight on this timely subject matter, and I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Andrew Wender, who is going to say a few more words about this evening's distinguished speaker.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So good afternoon, everybody. Good evening to our distinguished speaker. It is a privilege to have the opportunity to help welcome Dr. Philip Jenkins to give this Lansdowne lecture, which actually is the first in a series of two such Lansdowne lectures. The second part of Dr. Jenkins' lecture series will be next Tuesday at this same time. And I'd also like to thank the Faculty of Humanities for its generous help in supporting this event. Dr. Jenkins is Distinguished Professor of History and co-director of the program on Historical Studies of Religion at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He is the author of some 30 books, which attest to his exceptionally eclectic research interests in fields such as the study of global Christianity, past and present, new and emerging religious movements, and late modern US history, chiefly post-1975. My own familiarity with Dr. Jenkins' work prior to the release of the book Climate, Catastrophe, and Faith had been his remarkable book from 2017, Crucible of Faith, the ancient revolution that made our modern religious world, really demonstrating his extraordinary capacities with thinking about global Christianity in its formative late antiquarian period. And so when this new book was released, Climate, Catastrophe, and Faith, How Changes in Climate Drive Religious Upheaval, it really seemed like an exceptional opportunity to invite him to speak on, as my colleague observed, such a timely and urgent topic. And we're most grateful to him for taking up the opportunity to do so. So with that, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Jenkins. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very warm welcome, and it's a matter of great regret to me I can't be there personally. That's very high on my my wish list to be in that part of the world, but travel is not easy at the moment. In 1741, Jonathan Edwards, who was a Connecticut clergyman, gave one of the most famous sermons, maybe in history, certainly in North American history. It was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It was a major milestone launching what we call the Great Awakening in the development of evangelicalism. And it had an astonishing effect on its audience. We read about people literally rolling in the aisles, not laughing, but screaming and going into convulsions and fits, and they were terrified of this divine anger. What did it mean for them? Could they save themselves? Well, this has been studied in many different ways. It's been studied, of course, as history, as theology, as rhetoric. But of course, I'm sure you're all wondering, what was the weather like? And I'm very glad you asked that. No one's ever really paid attention to this because it's rather interesting that the previous 2 years before July 1741 were among the worst in the previous half millennium in the North Atlantic world. We read about 15 and 20-foot snowdrifts across New England. We read about the mass death of livestock, and North America got off much better than other parts of the world, particularly Ireland, which suffered a famine worse proportionately than the potato famine of the 1840s. Some countries in Europe lost a third of their population. And really, the phrase that is used is Arctic Ireland. And it seems to me that if you want to understand this tumultuous religious change without taking account of that climate context, you really are missing a very important part of the story. Now think again of the audiences listening to that presentation, listening to being told that you are sinners, God is angry, God could smite you down at a moment's notice. In other circumstances, you might have said, yeah, well, I'm not really religious. At this moment, this was a direct observed fact. The world was quite likely about to end. God was going to bring in judgment, and it was absolutely evident around. This brings in a couple of interesting points that I'll be developing. One is, right up until very modern times in the West, there is an overwhelming idea that the natural world is not something that just happens. It is directed by God. If things turn very, very bad, as they certainly had in 1740 and 41, it means that God is angry with someone or something. And how do you respond to that? Well, as an individual or a society, you can try and turn away from sin. You can reform. You can launch a new kind of religious movement to purify the world. And that's really one of the most benevolent ways of proceeding. The other way, which is much worse, is to decide who or what has annoyed God in terms of people or groups. And that is the point at which you turn against minorities, hated religious groups, who might, according to the setting, be Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Christians in Muslim societies. Oh, and such acts can lead to violence and war and rebellion. And if you trace the history and the consequences of some of these great episodes of climate change, climate catastrophe, you'll see that the map of religious denominations and faiths and where they are around the world has been very seriously impacted by these successive catastrophes, disasters, changes. And also the range of denominations that we have has been affected consequently. Now, so let me just emphasize one important thing. I'm talking about these catastrophes in the past. Do not please hear me as saying, well, things are very bad in the past. People talk about climate change right now. We've been here before. This is nothing new. We don't need to worry. Yes, we do need to worry for this reason. If you look at climate change episodes in the past, these were transient, temporary. They reflected a particular range of circumstances that would be reversed. You might, for instance, get the effect of a colossal volcano, which would darken the skies around the world, bring in famine and plague. But after maybe 4 or 5 years, that effect would go away. You can have longer lasting changes, but they too will last. What we're talking about in the modern world will be different. So that is the framework of what I'm talking about. And you can see this about 1739 to 41. Bizarre climatic conditions prevailed across the European continent. the Great Frost, Arctic Island, and that understates it because, in fact, that was also very strong in North America as well. What is happening? You know, it's very hard to talk about this without sounding like somebody presenting a myth in ancient Greece. Oh, you have the force of the sun, and you have the oceans, and you have these great mountains of fire. Well, yes, very literally. One of the great driving forces is, of course, the sun. If you map sunspot observations through the centuries, you realize that there are some periods when solar energy, the amount of energy the sun is releasing, becomes very light, very thin, and the world becomes much, much cooler. For example, one thing I'll be talking about, the late 17th century, there are no sunspots, basically. That means that the sun is not emitting much energy, and the world becomes horribly, miserably cold. Now, you know, if something like that happened today, you know, okay, joking reference, throw on another sweater. Imagine a world where growing seasons decide whether people get enough to eat. If you get a serious drop in temperature for a number of years, it means crops fail. It means there's famine. It means there are insurrections and rebellions and civil wars. Virtually all these climate episodes that I'm talking about, famine and climate disaster, is directly followed by a plague or a pestilence, maybe something that is a pandemic, as we're agonizingly familiar with, or a panzootic, that is, a disease that strikes animals across many countries and regions. And that, in some ways, is equally bad because that destroys people's livelihoods. If all the cattle die, all the sheep die. And there are some years, for example, and just to take one at random, 1709, it's one of the coldest years of the millennium. People die in their millions, and animals die in their millions. Economies are destroyed, and states collapse. And there are many, many religious consequences. So you have the sun. You have this great thing called the El Nino. You have the warming of the ocean currents becoming very intense or very very light, and the El Nino, when it reverses, sends enormous quantities of water across the Pacific, which tend to drive volcanoes and earthquakes. And some of those volcanoes are astonishing. I know if I'm talking to people in British Columbia, you know the idea of a tectonically active landscape. Some of those volcanoes have a global effect. There's a very well-studied one called Tambora in 1815, which is a category 7, which is as high as you get in reasonably modern times. And that has political and social and epidemiological and religious consequences around the world. Tambora was extreme, but it wasn't the only one. We can talk about this a lot in Q&A, but I would argue that you cannot understand, for example, the rise of Islam in the 620s without looking at a very comparable set of climatic and volcanological changes. And well, as I said, I will be talking quite a bit about volcanoes. There's quite a lot to say there. But let me just emphasize one thing. I'm talking about disasters and calamities. I do not wish to be known or remembered as Disaster Jenkins. Climate produces very good eras for human flourishing. We have what's called the medieval warm period. Growing seasons become longer, food production becomes much more intense, populations grow, towns grow, people have got a lot of money to put into activities. They are grateful to God. They put them into religious activities. And if you look at the years between about, shall we say, 1120 and 1260, this is the absolute center of the High Middle Ages. It is the time when they're building all the cathedrals. It's the time of the schools and the universities, the time of so many great religious orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans. They are products of a warm sun and warm seas and warm soil. And incidentally, one thing which I found quite an interesting fact, so you can look at these things as they happen, say, in Europe, and think, well, yeah, you have to explain that in terms of strictly European conditions. And then you realize, and you look at Korea, or you look at Japan, totally unconnected from what's happening in Europe, but they're having very similar religious responses to major climate changes. What's happening? Well, these are just much more prosperous eras. People have got a lot of spare money, and they put them into religious, cultural activities. And when something happens in France and in Spain, well, you can say there's influence between the two countries, fine. But when it happens in France and in Spain and in New Mexico and in Korea, then you think, we're looking at some kind of global phenomenon. And pretty much you have to look at some of these climatological circumstances. I could take any number of incidents. In fact, some of the best records for these climate changes are in the bristlecone pines of the American West, which grow kind of rings each year, and you can tell when there's been an incredibly bad cold year, and you get one of these every few hundred years, and you look at them, and you then look at the religious developments, the religious revolutions that are happening at those times, and there are some very interesting correlations. But I'm going to talk about a couple of eras where the changes are, I will argue, most marked, most consistent, and really easiest to understand. These are four friends of mine that I invited to assist my lecture. These are, of course, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. If you know the work of Neil Gaiman, they are in fact more properly described as the four horse persons of the apocalypse. But it makes a great point: famine, plague, death, and war. And can I just stress that again about famine and plague? We tend to see those stories as separate. They really aren't. I mentioned Tambora in 1815. Tambora causes black skies around the world. It cuts growing seasons. It spread famine. It also has dramatic effects in the Bay of Bengal, where some quite nasty organisms have a dramatic acceleration in their evolution and become what we know as cholera, and begin the cholera infestation, which is going to kill tens of millions of people around the world over the following century. Each of these big climate episodes is followed by an outbreak of plague, pestilence, influenza, cholera, whatever. There is a close link. When people spoke the language of apocalypse in trying to understand these catastrophes, that package made very good sense. When we look at apocalyptic movements, they evolve in response to moments like this. I'm not saying that climate is the only factor driving them, far from it. This isn't like a mechanistic attempt at prediction, but there's a pretty good correlation. Let me take one episode first of all, and that's what happens in the decade after the year 1315. I mentioned the High Middle Ages, when the sun is shining, when the growing seasons are long, and people go and settle these marginal lands. And from about 1290, things become very rapidly worse. And from 1315, and I use my next phrase very advisedly, they go to hell. Rains fall basically for years, almost unchecked. Crops are wiped out. Crops cannot be planted. You cannot make the salt you need to preserve food. You cannot preserve food through the winter. You get panzerwatics, you get pandemics. Now think about how you would respond to this in a religious society that knows that everything is in God's hands, and turn to one particular year, which has some claim to be one of the worst in human history, which is 1320. And 1320 is a golden age for conspiracy theories. It is an age not just when people strike at the heretics they can find, they invent new heresies with astonishing speed and dedication. When the kind of conspiracy theories that that people formulate are really remarkable, even if you're a connoisseur of such things. This is the year of the lepers plot, when the Muslims are driving the Jews and the lepers to infect Christian Europe and poison the wells. In response to this, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, ordinary peasants in France, form great armies, great throngs. They kill anyone who stands in their way, and the state basically faces collapse. The only thing they can do is to say, why not go in that direction? There are all sorts of enemies of God there. And eventually they are wiped out. This is called the Shepherd's Crusade. The anti-Semitism in this year, so many of the myths that we think about in anti-Semitism about the evils of Jews come out of specific eras like this. Much of what we know about witchcraft does not come from the early 14th century. It comes from the year 1320. When there is a pope who is a fanatical conspiracy theorist, and he is the first one who puts together the idea of witchcraft as an alternative religion that you enter by signing a pact with the devil. And this is the point at which we get the idea of an alternate religion with its alternate great meetings, its Sabbaths, its witches' Sabbaths. And those ideas jog along for a while, and it's in the next climate explosion in the 1430s that they move to their next stage of evolution. As I said, this is a great age when there are massacres of Jews. And I mentioned the idea of drawing the maps. The 1320 crisis feeds into the 1330s, 1340s. You're dealing with an extremely weakened population. And this redraws the map of the world's Jews and where they are. It's what drives so many of the Jews out of Western Europe, and they seek refuge in Eastern Europe, in countries that we'd call Belarus and Lithuania and Poland, and countries where they would remain until the 1940s. This is a fascinating one. These are the flagellants. And a flagellant is somebody who decides to appease God's wrath with the world by marching together with friends, whipping themselves as they go until the blood is extreme. and you may think this is a marginal phenomenon. There are tens of thousands of these flagellants in these great processions. And they're a very, what shall I say, a periodical event. And they coincide almost exactly with these great climate catastrophes. 1320 is one great one. The late 1430s are a beauty. When you know that there are flagellants, I can tell you what the price of grain is going to be in that year. I can tell you what the temperatures are going to be in that year. That is something that is almost mechanistic. And of course, the flagellants will also attack Jews and so on. And this really gets into a, if you like, a mindset in the late Middle Ages. It creates this idea of the dance of death, a very popular idea in the late Middle Ages. The idea that you have these great individuals, the kings and the queens and the popes, and they're led in this great dance by the corpses. This era comes to be absolutely fascinated with corpses and skeletons, and art like this really proliferates during those climate events. I could talk about various eras, but one of the very interesting one, the mid-16th century. Most of us, if we sat down and said, what happened in the year 1540, would, unless we were specialists in the Reformation, would come up with a blank. 1540 is an interesting year. It sees the worst drought in Europe, certainly for a half millennium. There is no rain. The rivers dry up. And you think of the religious consequences. Just think imaginatively what you would do if you were in that era and you saw something like that. You would know, first of all, that God is angry. You would know that something needed to be done, and different people respond differently. In the city of Geneva, for example, the good people who had very wisely kicked out John Calvin as a theocratic monster a few years earlier invite him back to rule them in the most rigid theocratic style he can possibly manage. Roman Catholics have a different response. They know that there is a great conspiracy against the city of God. It is directed by chiefly Anabaptists and by secret arsonists, Mordbrenner, who are causing all the fires around the place. Now, you might say, if there's a drought, everything is very dry, haystacks and wooden houses are very, very likely to burn. But you and I know it's actually the Anabaptists, and these people have to be hunted down. And that's very representative. So you get a religious reform movement together with the persecution of minorities and scapegoats and dissidents. Not long after that, you get the 1560s. You may have heard of something called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age lasts basically for about 500 years, lasts from 1320 through 1850. But it has some eras which are appallingly bad in the middle of that. And one runs from about 1560 to 1630, coincides almost exactly with the life of William Shakespeare, when volcanoes are going off very frequently in the Pacific Ocean and around the Pacific Rim. They are having catastrophic effects around the world. This painting is a very famous one. It's the Triumph of Death from 1562, which exactly represents the mood of the time. And it's hard to really say just how bad things are in Europe, for example. All the great rivers freeze. You can walk across the Rhine or the Seine or the Thames. The Thames, they don't just walk across it, they set up a miniature city on it, a fair with booths and circus acts and so on. It has a dreadful effect of disease. There are new epidemics bursting forth. And the 1560s are also a time of various religious explosions, when, for instance, Protestants strike at Catholic churches in this enormous outbreak of iconoclasm that's called the Storm of Images, which strip bare so many of the churches of Europe. It is reflected in the formation of new religious groups, which are much more hard-edged. The Calvinists reach a new maturity. The Calvinists discuss all these interesting theological ideas, like some of them develop a theology of assassination, which very explicitly addresses ideas of terrorism. How do you justify something like that? The world's about to end. This is evident to anyone who is not an idiot. Virtually all our stereotypes of witchcraft stem from this sort of era, 1560 to about the 1630s. Whenever you see the witches in the hats, those aren't special witch hats. Those are the very standard hats of women in the early 17th century. And the 1560s are one of the great eras of this. By the way, the last one was a fictional imaginative painting, The Triumph of Death. This is a somewhat similar painting from 1572, which is when the Catholics of France decide to solve the Protestant problem with a final solution once and for all. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And we can tell the history of this, and we can report, which prince said what to which duke or which duchess. But if you don't pay attention to what's happening to temperatures, famine, death rates, these things just don't make sense. These are responses to a very large climate catastrophe. And think of living in a world like this, and this is a sort of simple visual representation. We die, and this is the figure of death. I follow, we fly. These are people fleeing the plague. I want to talk about one era in particular. And I could be talking about the 530s or the 620s, but I'm going to talk about one, which is what happens after the year 1675, when a lot of things that we know in the world today happened in quite a revolutionary way. And we may know a lot about them as individual events, but what I'm trying to do is contextualize them. Round about the year 1675, the world became extremely, extremely cold. And I emphasize the world. If you were living in Cairo, in Egypt at that point, the main fashion items were extremely warm Russian furs, which you needed to get through the summer. Things became very cold. Crops died in large numbers. There were new diseases, new plagues, and this carried on for a number of years. In England, for instance, the year 1679 had some of the highest death rates anywhere. It was a famine year in France. What you're actually seeing in that slide is the River Thames, where, as you see, the ice is approximately 10 to 12 feet thick, and they are getting ready to build a city, build fairs on top of that. Well, once again, how do you respond? It's a golden age for witchcraft again. In Sweden, for example, which has been hit extremely hard by the climate catastrophe, this is the great age of their witch trials. And so much of what witches do, by the way, remember this, is weather magic. They drive winds, they sink ships, they destroy crops. And in an age when people are likely to die very frequently, who are the main suspects? Well, they're the people who are in charge of the bedroom, and the kitchen and the nursery and the herb garden, or women. And I always think this is a very large part of why so many of the witch persecutions end up being directed against women. There are no witches. There are Presbyterians. There are evangelicals. And if you want to understand the history, you have to understand their origins in, 1679. It's in the late 1670s when radical Presbyterians and Calvinists in Scotland and Ireland become revolutionary. They rise against the British state. They're defeated with extreme brutality, and they have a couple of responses to that. One is they form new ways of worshipping. They gather in fields for what we call field preaching, not in the parish churches. And a lot of those people then move on to North America. And there's an absolutely direct line from the field preaching that these people are developing in 1679 to what's going to become the camp meetings of the American frontier in the late 18th century. I mentioned I was currently in Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania. White European settlement in this region was begun by a man called James Potter, who was a refugee from Ireland during the Great Arctic Island Famine of 1741. There's a very precise continuity there. Well, I wanted a dramatic image. This is one. The famines, the plagues, the crisis, they drive religious revolutions. And in Eastern Europe, they drive great revolutions against the Habsburg Empire. The Ottoman Turks try to take advantage of this, and this launches a great European war. When the Turks are decisively defeated, when they try to take Vienna in 1683, and that really marks the gradual withdrawal of Islam from southeastern Europe. The Turks, by the way, are having a very difficult time because in the Balkans and in Anatolia, they're facing something like an ice age. The Bosporus in Constantinople is frozen solid. And it does give an idea of the climate dimensions of some of these struggles. People are fighting through snow and ice in places where they absolutely did not expect to be fighting through snow and ice. It's in 1675 when Philip Spener publishes his great book, which basically provides the foundation of pietism. And this is the foundation of ideas that we're very familiar with in later Christianity, such as born-again conversion and small group practice within churches, which are both absolutely fundamental to evangelicalism. Well, they happen in Germany, but as people hunt out religious dissidents around the place, they drive them overseas. In France, for example, the French decide to drive out their Protestants. They have to go somewhere. They go to New England, they go to New York, they go to South Africa, they go to England. They take these very hardcore Protestant ideas with them. You get pietists scattered around the world. Many of them end up in, once again, Pennsylvania, founded in 1682 for all these refugees that have suddenly been created by this appalling climate-driven crisis. And I can talk about this at great length, and I won't, but Pennsylvania, among other things, is the great center for the religious dissidents of Northwestern Europe, of Germany, of the Netherlands, of Great Britain. It's also the absolute pioneer of ideas of religious liberty, which at the time seem off the wall crazy, but which within a few decades are going to spread around the world and become the basis of US policy. Think of it this way. Think of, if you like, religious history proceeding in a fairly steady, gradual, evolutionary way, and suddenly you get these absolutely explosive eras of religious chaos and persecution, which tend to be these climate-driven episodes. And it's after those that we find the emergence of what? Apocalyptic movements, prophetic movements, reform, revivalist movements, and also refugees and exiles carrying those ideas around the world. In the 1320s, that's not feasible. By the 17th, by the 18th century, it's a more globalized world. People can sail off to Virginia or South Africa or the Caribbean, and they do. And they take these religious ideas with them. I don't want to trample too much on your time. I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I will just mention one thing. The other great episode that I've studied in some detail is what happens in 1740 and 41. Again, absolutely horrific year, not driven in this case by volcanoes, probably a change in ocean currents in the North Atlantic. And it's also the year which is the core of the Great Awakening, the Great Evangelical Revival, and at the same time, extreme conspiracy theory. And, you know, some of these eras of conspiracy and paranoia, it seems almost random who end up as the targets. You have this astonishingly cold year. People are driven into their houses. A lot of houses burn because, you know, people are gathered around the fire. The fire spreads. And what that obviously means is somebody must be to blame. The enemies of God, to which Black slaves and Roman Catholic priests, who are duly arrested and killed in fair numbers or exiled. It seems in some ways bizarre that you would have a revival movement here and conspiracy paranoia here. If you look at what's happening in the larger world and the apocalyptic atmosphere of the time, it's not that surprising. The two are really halves of one thing, the conspiracy and the Great Awakening. I don't want to go into this in too much more detail, but let me just say one thing. I can look at other episodes of this. During the 19th century, the West develops means of protecting and cultivating food so that it is not as subject as it was in earlier eras to these sudden disasters. So, for example, just this year in Tonga in the Pacific, there was a volcano which was a grade 6, which in earlier eras would have caused global disasters. And, you know, it's something that we happen to read about in a science magazine. It doesn't affect us. We moved to a sense of climate as something that happened to other people. What I believe, and what I will show in my next presentation, is that so much of the world today, the world that is going to be radically affected by the climate change that we're living through right now, still lives in social and economic structures and religious worldviews very much like that of the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. And that many of the features that we saw in those earlier eras in Europe or North America, we will be seeing again in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in terms of scapegoating, in terms of driving political chaos, but also, I will argue, of driving new religious movements. the famous phrase of past performance is the best predictor of future achievement. I will suggest that the past obviously predicts the future. If you want to understand the past of our Euro-American societies, you have to pay attention to climate. If you want to understand the global future, particularly of religion, then you have to understand climate. Please excuse me for presenting that in a very abbreviated form, but we can talk about this. And as I say, I'll be talking about this a lot more next time. I will come to an end there. I will stop sharing, and I will throw that open for discussion or screams of protest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really wide-ranging, chronologically and geographically, and frankly, quite gripping presentation. And I know that people must be very eager indeed to hear the second half on next Tuesday at the same time. So again, I know that colleagues have been welcomed by Rachel Brown to put their questions into the Q&A, into the chat, and I will be pleased to read those out. While people are thinking of their questions, may I just go ahead and ask one? There's so many things I would wish to know. I really do want to ask if you would be kind enough at some point, if not today, then maybe Tuesday, to elaborate on that 620s context for the development of Islam. But there's actually another sort of conceptual question I wanted to ask, if I may, please. And it's about the aspect of chance. I know that you will be talking perhaps more toward the present day on Tuesday. And of course, in all the eras you're referring to here, there's no such thing as predictive climate modeling, for example.
Right.
So what does that element of chance, the eruption of an unpredictable event, do to the whole dynamic that you're referring to here? Thank you.
You mean in the future, or
when these events, these episodes in climate catastrophe come seemingly out of nowhere, as I infer they might have in these
they absolutely
circumstances.
do.
And then what does that, how does that influence the religious after effects, if at all?
There's no such thing as chance. If you live in the worldview of the 16th century, for example, there is no such thing as chance. You know that you see the consequences around you in terms of catastrophic effects, in terms of famine, in terms of legions of beggars and refugees on the streets. This did not happen for nothing. And it's actually really surprising how late it is in Western history, in the history of France or Britain or the United States, before people are prepared to say, yes, this just happened. There's always this very strong idea, which I think is built into human nature, to seek some kind of purpose behind this. The Islam one, I'll just say very, very, very quickly. There's now a lot of work about the long droughts from the late 6th and early 7th centuries that are having a major effect, obviously, on Arabia. You have the Muhammad with his movement, and it's not doing very well. And in 625, there's one of these absolutely colossal volcanoes somewhere, which crushes empires across northern Asia. The Eastern Turkic Empire goes down. That very specifically affects a battle between the Romans and the Persians, when the Romans and the Persians can't fight because the sky is suddenly so black around them. The Romans manage to win, but both empires are destroyed. Meanwhile, Muhammad's enemies suddenly start seeing, this man who's talking about the apocalypse and the end of the world? Well, yes, he really is onto something. And the turnaround is 626 AD. which is a frighteningly good correlation between what we know of the climate effects. And I can talk a lot about that, and it's very specific, but I'll just throw that out right now.
Thank you so much. May I please share a question from William Campbell? And William says as follows. What I find interesting in this exercise of historical reflection, just forgive me, there we go. What I find interesting in this exercise of historical reflection is that time and again, religion perceived these climate events as the wrath of God that required a response on the part of humanity, even if that response was in the form of violence and discriminatory scapegoating.
Yeah.
By contrast, it seems that the predominant religious response to climate disaster today, at least in much of Christian America, appears to be denial, requiring no response on the part of humans, since it isn't happening, or in case it is happening, it isn't humans' fault. William concludes as follows. I recognize that you're an historian, but do you have any commentary that might account for this discrepancy? What has changed in religion that alleviates humans of responsibility to respond to climate events? William, thank you so much.
Yeah, very good question. I touched on this a little bit when I mentioned this idea of, from the late 19th century, people in the West believed that they had, so to speak, escaped from climate. It wasn't something that really affected them. When there were famines, for example, they were clearly human-made. They were responses to war. By the way, the reason they were getting all these ideas about the need for violence, they're getting it very much from the Bible. They're getting it from Old Testament ideas, particularly, and this is not to stigmatize the Old Testament as such. If you look at the modern world and the near future, I think the responses that you are seeing, particularly in African nations, look much more like the older world and older realities. And I've done a lot of work, for instance, on Muslim movements in the Western Sahel, where the responses to these crises, which are hitting very hard there, could have been in 17th century Europe. They're very, very similar. And there's one very precise example. We today live in the, I've used the phrase before, golden age of witchcraft trials and prosecutions. There are more witchcraft persecutions today than there have been for the last couple of centuries combined. Witchcraft is a huge phenomenon in Africa, Christian Africa, Muslim Africa. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest that anything has changed so much in religion. It's just if you're in the Netherlands, if you're in the United States, we believe that we have the technology and the money that we can escape many of the worst consequences of this, of these changes, and they're not going to affect us directly, or at least for a long, long time. It's when there is an immediate, direct, cataclysmic effect that people respond in what you might call that traditional way. So it's not that human beings have changed, that religion has changed. It's just things have happened in different parts of the world.
Thank you so much. May I share the next question from Aksa Ijaz? And Aksa asks, hello, Professor Jenkins. Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. I'm eagerly looking forward to the second part of your talk next week. My question regards the parallel you made earlier about the rise of Islam in the 600s and the climate conditions in that era. Could you please speak a bit more about those conditions? What do we know of the climate change in the 600s in Arabia and how exactly it was related to the mission of Muhammad? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that in a response to you a few minutes ago. As I said, very interesting work right now in terms of the role of drought on the Arab tribes in the years up to Muhammad's message. If you like, you're creating a very disaffected, desperate population with a great deal of fear and hostility and jealousy of the elites. People are willing to hear these messages, but it's in the conditions of particularly the year 626. You have you have the time going into the Battle of the Trench. When the disastrous climate conditions relating to this huge, apparently volcanic eruption, disrupt the trade networks. They are destroying the economic basis of the Macan elites. And they suddenly shift the balance in the struggle. Also, they create these climate changes. Also, are a death blow for the great dueling superpowers of the day, Rome and Byzantium. That means that when Arab Islamic forces pour out of Arabia after 632, it means they are basically kicking down a door into an empty house. There's no way that Rome and Byzantium and Persia would have let this happen 10 or 20 years ago. They have been gutted by these climate changes, by the way, which are so bad that they show up very dramatically in bristlecone pines in California. You can actually see the year which marks 626, 627. You can see how bad it is.
Thank you so much. Now, I want to share at least one more question. I imagine it is possible that some more that are popping up might need to be deferred till Tuesday, but going in order, I have one from Holly Ratcliffe. So Holly says, our presentation focuses on certain kinds of religious reactions to climate disasters. Some of them even seem violent or apocalyptic. I am surprised you do not include contemplative or mystical responses. I'm thinking, for example, of the 14th century English mystics at the time of the plague, in which there was no projection of violence onto God. How would you interpret their existence?
Yeah, and please understand, I'm not saying that violence is always a response. So, for instance, with the Great Awakening of the 18th century, that is in no way a violent response. I'll give you another good example. You mentioned the 14th century. One of the greatest and easily detectable climate catastrophes happens in the 530s. And there are two basically super volcanoes that hit together that leads to a dreadful plague, the plague of Justinian around the world. And you can map the response of monasteries to that, particularly in Ireland. That's where the Irish monasteries come from. You can also see them in Mesopotamia. If the world is such a dreadful, damned place, then of course people withdraw from the world. And the kind of contemplative response that you're talking about is exactly what we might expect. What also happens is if civil society collapses at the same time, then the monasteries, almost despite themselves, are going to end up with political power in the world. So I'm saying violence is one reaction, and it's something you do see, but a lot of people do have these, what you might call inner spiritual responses. And I mentioned Spener and Pietism in the 1670s, the whole idea of born again, heart religion, and so on. That's in no sense a violent response, but it's a revolutionary response.
Dr. Jenkins, thank you so much for superb talk tonight. Looking forward so much to the next one on Tuesday. For the close, may I please give it back over to my colleague, Kathy Chan.
Yes, and I will just echo Andrew and Thank you, Professor Jenkins, on behalf of the center and all of us here at UVic, and get everyone to come back for part 2, which I think will set up now to be a really interesting talk. And so we'll see you hopefully next Tuesday. So we're normally Thursdays. So note in your calendar, it's Tuesday next week, online again at 5 o'clock. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.